Notice, we meet today to mark up 5 bipartisan measures, and without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit any statements or any extraneous material for the record on today's business. Members were notified yesterday we intend to consider today's measures en bloc, and so without objection, the following items previously provided to members will be considered en bloc and are considered as read. We have Senate Bill 371, the Department of State Authorities Improvements Act, with Engel Amendment 34 and Royce Amendment 35 to that Senate bill. We have H.R. 2484, the Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2017. House Resolution 351, condemning the violence and persecution in Chechnya, along with the Keating Amendment 12 to House Resolution 351. We have House Resolution 354, condemning the violence against peaceful protesters outside the Turkish ambassador's residence on May 16, 2017. And we have House Resolution 355, condemning the terrorist attacks in Manchester, United Kingdom, on May 22nd. I now recognize myself to speak on today's business. And moving on to the markup agenda, speaking a little bit here about Senate Bill 371. This makes several technical and minor corrections to the state authorities bill that became law at the end of last year, but in particular, this measure ensures that the authorizing and appropriations committees of the House and Senate continue to work closely together on oversight of the Department of State and foreign operations accounts. We're also taking up, as I mentioned, H.R. 2484, the Women, Peace, and Security Act. Now, last year, this committee held a hearing where we heard powerful testimony about the importance of including women in peace negotiations around the world. We heard specifically from some of the women who helped set the fundamental agreement, the Good Friday Agreement in Ireland, the peace agreement there. Also learned of some of the personal tragedies visited upon them and their loved ones as a result. But they stuck with that and were instrumental to that Belfast Agreement being completed, and it has brought peace. So women have the fundamental right to be represented in discussions affecting their lives. But when we also see better outcomes when they participate, as we have in terms of the peace holding around the world whenever women are also involved in these negotiations, other than just factions or warlords or governments represented solely by men, we begin to understand the importance of this particular agreement. Peace agreements are more likely to be reached and last when women are involved. Promoting women's participation represents an opportunity for improving U.S. efforts to resolve conflicts, improve peacekeeping missions, and counter human trafficking. So I thank Ranking Member Engel and the bill's sponsors, Representatives Noem and Schakowsky, for their excellent work on this bipartisan issue. And I also want to thank Ranking Member Engel for working with me on House Resolution 354, condemning the unwarranted attack last week on peaceful protesters outside the Turkish ambassador's residence. That evening, armed members of President Erdogan's security detail savagely beat and choked and kicked protesters in an unprovoked assault aimed at silencing these American citizens' right to free speech and assembly. And this isn't the first time this has happened with a Turkish delegation to the United States. This timely resolution sends a clear signal to the Turkish government that we will not allow any foreign government to stifle the rights of our citizens. It also calls on the State Department and Secret Service to review their security procedures to prevent another incident like this from occurring. This is the third incident. The rights of free expression and peaceful protest are fundamental values in any democracy. By passing this resolution, we reaffirm our commitment to protect these rights against all who seek to suppress them. I also want to thank Representatives Meeks and Cook for working quickly to introduce House Resolution 355, condemning the terror attack in Manchester. This nail bomb set off by a suicide bomber claimed the lives of 22 innocent people, many of them children, many of them teenagers, leaving a concert on what should have been a joyful and carefree occasion. It left many, many people maimed as a result. And this resolution rightly condemns this horrific attack and pledges our unwavering support to the United Kingdom. Lastly, we consider House Resolution 351, condemning the violence and persecution in Chechnya, where Chechnyan strongman Ramzan Kadyrov is waging a brutal campaign against men who are gay, including their abduction, their detention, their torture. The Russian newspaper, which broke this story, has also been threatened. There needs to be a serious investigation and a stop to this medieval violence. Russia cannot tolerate such intolerable brutality and also purport to be worthy of participating on the global stage. I want to thank Chairman Emeritus Ross Leitonen, Ranking Member Engel, Representatives Issa and Cicilline and Smith for their work on this important resolution. And I also appreciate the amendment offered by Representative Keating, which makes clear that the perpetrators of this violence should be vetted for sanctions against human rights law. And I now recognize the Ranking Member for his remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this morning's markup. I am also pleased to support this entire slate of good bipartisan measures. I hope at our next markup we can get to marking up the bill I introduced with Mr. Connolly, the Secure Our Democracy Act. The bill represents a tough response to Russia's interference in last year's election, and it would send a clear message that if you meddle in American democracy, there are going to be consequences. It's a common-sense bill, and we were moving in a positive direction to make it a bipartisan measure. So I hope the next time we have this markup, the bill will have bipartisan support, and we will be able to advance the bill. With respect to the measures before us today, the committee is taking quick action to respond to two troubling events in recent days. The first, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, is a resolution condemning the barbaric attack that ripped through an arena in Manchester, England, earlier this week. Mr. Chairman, the horrific evil deliberately targets innocent children. Many of us have sons or daughters, and we certainly know the happiness and community we feel going to concerts with friends and family when we were younger, and that our children feel the same way today. This attack reminds us of the threat violent extremism poses, the sort of indiscriminate carnage terrorists are willing to inflict. And in the wake of this tragedy, we stand with our British partners and friends in mourning and recovery as we work together to meet this shared challenge. This was not just an attack on the UK, it was an attack on civilization. I'm pleased to support this measure, which sends this important message. Secondly, I'm sure we've all seen video of what happened last week at a protest of Turkish President Erdogan's visit. I was shocked. The last thing we expect to see in the United States is a strongman's thug silencing peaceful protesters. I had been invited actually to go to that meeting at the Turkish embassy. I didn't go, and I'm glad I didn't go because I was just horrified when I heard what happened. Turkey is a NATO ally and a key partner on many issues, but what happened last week is unacceptable. This resolution calls for those responsible to face justice. This is a much bigger issue. We've seen a troubling pattern from Turkey in recent years, but if Turkish government officials come to our country and try to stifle American democracy and freedom of speech, there must be consequences. I'm also pleased to support the Women, Peace and Security Act offered by Representative Schakowsky and Noem. This bill has its roots in the Obama administration's 2011 executive order on women, peace and security. This order took into account the fact that a range of global issues are better addressed when women are involved. Conflict prevention, crisis resolution, peace building. Research has shown again and again and again that when women are at the center of these processes, the outcomes are better. So a few years ago, President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton took steps to ensure our foreign policy focused on getting more women involved when it came to resolving these challenges. Since then, we've seen good results, and we want to make those results permanent. This bill, which we advanced last Congress, would put into law parts of the executive order and work to build even more on these earlier successes. I'm pleased to co-sponsor this bill, and I hope this time around we're able to get it across the finish line. I ask unanimous consent to enter co-author of this legislation, Representative Jan Schakowsky of Illinois' statement into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm also a proud co-sponsor of a resolution condemning the unlawful detention, torture, and murder of gay men in Chechnya. Hundreds of gay men have been rounded up by local Chechnyan authorities, some killed and some tortured because of their sexual orientation. Chechen authorities deny this, and the Kremlin looks the other way. But the truth has found its way into the light, and now is the time for people around the world to speak out against these abuses. President Putin must end these abuses. He must respect and promote the dignity of all persons and provide safe haven for all those fleeing such horrific persecution. I want to thank Representatives Ross Leitonen and Cicilline for their hard work on this measure. And lastly, I'm glad we are advancing a bill to make a number of minor technical corrections to our State Department authorization legislation that President Obama signed into law last year. During the last Congress, for the first time since 2002, this committee worked together in a bipartisan manner to get a State Department authorization bill to the President's desk. I was very pleased with it. The Chairman worked very hard on it, and so did I, and so did members of this committee. Our legislation helped to modernize the Department and provide our diplomats with the tools and resources they need to do their jobs. Diplomats are at the front line of American foreign policy, and their efforts are needed now more than ever. So I want to thank all our members for their hard work on these measures. And again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this markup. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. Now we go to Eliana Ross-Leitonen of Florida.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Engel. And it was a pleasure to have worked with both of you, along with Mr. Issa, Mr. Cicilline, and Mr. Smith, in introducing House Resolution 351, condemning the violence and persecution in Chechnya. This committee has a long-standing tradition of speaking out on behalf of marginalized populations all over the world, especially those who live under the shadow of oppression and tyranny. We know that freedom and human rights are universal and for all people to enjoy, no matter their sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, race, or any other basis. And because we believe in this cause, this body cannot sit idly by while hundreds of men are being beaten and tortured, and some even killed by Chechen authorities. This bipartisan resolution calls on the Chechen leader to immediately cease the abduction and violence of men based on their real or perceived sexual orientation, and calls on Putin to uphold international commitments and protect the human rights of all people. We have a responsibility to answer to the plight of this vulnerable community, call for swift action to end these atrocities, and ensure that the perpetrators are brought to justice. I thank every one of our colleagues from both sides of the aisle who have added their names in support of this resolution, which sends a unified message that the United States remains committed to promoting human rights and that this crisis must end now. I would also like to offer my support to House Resolution 354, the Chairman and Ranking Member's measure condemning the violence by Turkish President Erdogan and his security detail against protesters here in Washington last week. Later today, my friend and Florida colleague Gus Bilirakis and I will be sending a letter to the Department of Justice and the Department of State asking for immediate accountability from the Turkish government for these disgraceful attacks. This behavior is intolerable. Allies do not attack U.S. citizens on American soil, and foreign nationals who cannot respect the rule of law in our great nation should not be able to enjoy its rights and privileges. Our letter asks those involved in last week's attacks be brought to justice immediately, with the participating Turkish personnel in the U.S. expelled and those abroad barred from future entry. Many of our colleagues here today have already added their names to the letters, and I hope that anyone interested can add their names as well. I offer my full support to the Chairman and Ranking Member's resolution and encourage my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Eliana. Bill Keating of Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you and the Ranking Member for holding this markup and offer my support to all the measures that are being considered and of which I'm proud to co-sponsor. These include the Women, Peace, and Security Act, and where we underscore that women participating as meaningful actors in national security issues make us safer and is critical if we're going to be effective in addressing the complex security issues that face us today. It also includes a resolution condemning violence in front of the Turkish embassy. I'd also like to thank Congressman Meeks and Cook, as well as the Chairman and Ranking Member, for offering the resolution condemning the terrorist attack in Manchester this week. As a parent myself, my heart goes out to the families and communities affected by this callous and cowardly act. I'd also like to thank the Chairman and Ranking Member, as well as the fellow members in the committee, Congresswoman Ross-Lehtinen, Congressman Cicilline and Smith, for their leadership in introducing the resolution condemning the violence in Chechnya. The violence being perpetrated by state actors against innocent men in Chechnya is despicable, and it's critical that we speak out against these horrific crimes. In addition, I've offered my amendment, included in the en bloc, because it's important that our presidents speak out and take action as well to help ensure that this administration acts in accordance with two very important human rights laws brought forward through our committee. My amendment calls on the government to identify those individuals who must be sanctioned for their heinous acts of violence under the Magnitsky Rule of Law and Accountability Act and the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act. All these things we are dealing today were done in a bipartisan basis and again speaks to the importance of this committee as a strong voice in our country's policy going forward. I'd like to thank all members of the committee for their cooperative efforts, and I yield back. Magnitsky.
And for yielding back, and we go to Mr. Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and Ranking Member Engel again for putting forward a very, very good grouping of bipartisan bills and resolutions, and I support them all. I want to make special note that the resolution on the violence against American citizens outside the Turkish embassy after Erdogan had visited with President Trump is especially egregious. There's a woman from New Jersey. Her name is Karine Barazan. She lives in East Rutherford, New Jersey. As she has pointed out, a security officer put her in a headlock, threatened to kill her during the altercation. Like many members of this committee, I'm sure, I watched the video depiction of this and was, you know, the police couldn't even contain it when these thugs from Erdogan's government went after American citizens. She, you know, was hurt during this. She is asking for justice, and she absolutely deserves it. And at least 12 people, including a police officer, were hurt during the melee. And as she said, you know, violence is never an appropriate response to free speech, and we support the rights of people everywhere. And you know, this is something that the U.S. Department of State said, and again, a New Jerseyan and people from throughout our country were hurt by these so-called security officers. I also want to thank Ileana Ros-Lehtinen for her leadership on H-Res 351. The fact that, and it appears to be beyond any dispute, that about 100 men, due to their actual or suspected sexual orientation, were abducted, detained, and tortured, and as many as 3 have been killed, maybe more. And that is outrageous, and that needs to be condemned roundly, as this legislation does. Then, of course, the Manchester attacks, again, another senseless manifestation of radical jihadist hate. It needs to be roundly criticized, and this resolution would put the entire U.S. House of Representatives on record in so doing. And again, the new bill, Kristi Noem's Women, Peace, and Security Act, is another very strong assertion, backed by truth, that we need more women in peacemaking capabilities and capacities in government and elsewhere. And I think this is a very good affirmation by this committee and then, by extension, by the Congress to do just that. And I thank the Chair, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, Mr. David Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and the Ranking Member for holding this markup today to consider 5 important bipartisan pieces of legislation, which I'm proud to support. I'd like to start by conveying my sincere condolences to the families, friends, and loved ones of those who were lost and those who were injured in this despicable act of terrorism that took place in Manchester this week. Their suffering has in many ways just begun, and I'll keep them in my prayers as they move forward from this despicable attack. Before I address the legislation before us today, I regret that I have to once again register my profound disappointment that it is now almost June and this committee still has not considered a single piece of legislation to respond to the unprecedented attack leveled against us by Russia last year. As 17 of our intelligence agencies agree, throughout the 2016 presidential campaign, Russia carried out a large-scale concerted hacking and propaganda effort meant to undermine our democracy and interfere in our elections. More than 2 months ago, we held an eye-opening hearing on Russia's ongoing attempts to undermine Western democracies, during which we heard from witness after witness that Russia's intentions are clearly to weaken the United States, our partners, and our alliances. Yet this Congress has done nothing to respond to this attack. This is nothing short of an abrogation of our responsibility as lawmakers. I've spoken in the past in support of legislation that I've introduced, legislation that Mr. Engel and Mr. Conley have introduced, but I implore you, Mr. Chairman, if you don't like our bills, let's consider something, anything, that will show the Russians and other countries who we know are watching that there will be consequences for the interference in our democratic elections. The longer we let the issue of Russian interference go unaddressed, the more it interferes with the other important and bipartisan issues that we all want to see move forward. We're considering pieces of legislation today that have strong bipartisan support and that tackle extremely timely and serious issues, and I want to thank the Chairman and Ranking Member for the work they've done to ensure that these measures come to the committee quickly and in a bipartisan way. I want to thank Mr. Meeks for introducing H.Res. 355, which condemns the terrorist attacks in Manchester and reiterates our dedication to fighting extremism and terrorism worldwide while paying tribute to the British first responders who acted selflessly in the face of danger. Our thoughts and prayers are with the victims, their families, and the British people. We stand strong and united with our close ally, and together we will continue to fight against those who threaten to destroy democratic values through violent and nonviolent means. I want to thank my friend, Congresswoman Ileana Ross-Layton, for introducing H.Res. 351, which condemns the violence and persecution in Chechnya. She, along with Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, has shown great leadership in making sure that the atrocities being perpetuated against gay men in Chechnya do not go unnoticed. And she has been a strong voice for many years in condemning violence and hate against the LGBT community. I'd also like to thank Mr. Smith, Mr. Eiser, and Mr. Lowenthal for their work on this resolution as well. I also want to voice my support for the amendment being offered by my colleague, Mr. Keating, to this legislation that will make clear that the brutal targeting of suspected gay men by Chechen authorities is sanctionable under U.S. law. This resolution will send a strong message to Chechen officials who have overseen the arrest, detainment, torture, and murder of gay or suspected gay men. The language being used by Chechen authorities in respect to these activities is shocking. And with reports that the President Kadyrov has indicated that he wants to wipe Chechnya free of any gay men before Ramadan. This type of language and concerted campaign against the gay men of Chechnya is an atrocity that must be condemned in the strongest terms by the international community. I'd also like to speak out in support of H.Res. 354, condemning the violence against protesters outside the Turkish ambassador's residence on May 16, of which I'm a co-sponsor. The attacks carried out by President Erdogan's so-called security detail against American citizens and legal residents were absolutely appalling and will not be tolerated. I look forward to covering this issue in more depth in the subcommittee hearing on this topic this afternoon. And once again, I'd like to thank the sponsors of each of these pieces of legislation and reemphasize my strong support. And with that, I yield back the mic.
Would my friend yield?
Yes, of course.
I thank my friend from Rhode Island. I just want to add my voice. I'm very pleased at the bipartisan pieces of legislation in front of us and happy to support them. But I exhort the chairman, it was our understanding that the Engel-Connolly bill on sanctions against countries that interfere in our elections was going to be in the markup scheduled today. It was pulled, and we would welcome some direction from the chairman as to when it might be rescheduled. We think this is an important statement we hope will be bipartisan, and I would ask the chairman if he could respond. I thank my friend from
I know there is interest in Mr. Engel's efforts to press back on election hacking and on interference of the Russian government in our election, and Mr. Cicilline's as well. And we're looking at both measures, and we are working to try to develop bipartisan support for both measures. I will say that we do have sanctions on 9 Russian entities now. We have sanctions on the GRU. We have sanctions on the FSB, their 2 main intelligence services, and also sanctions on the individual officers of the GRU, 4 of them that were involved. along with 3 companies that provided material support for the GRU. We're looking at ways of sending an additional message. And I will mention also that last week the House passed this committee's legislation to throw the book at Russia in terms of other activities, including their activities in supporting the Syrian regime and arms to the Syrian regime. So my hope is to keep working with the members to continue to highlight Russia's dangerous activities and advance legislation in a way that all the members could support.
The Chairman would just indulge follow-up.
Yes.
And with respect to the Engel-Connolly bill, is it the intention of the Chairman to, at some point, schedule that for markup?
I wish to schedule that for markup.
I thank the Chair.
I hope to. I also hope to try to work out, on our ballistic missile legislation. I'm trying to work that in a way that all members can support it. But we will continue to try to move.
I know both Mr. Engel and I would be glad to work with the Chair to make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Joe Wilson of South Carolina.
Thank you, Chairman Ed Royce, for your bipartisan leadership with Ranking Member Elliott Engel to expedite these important resolutions. I support all the legislation being considered today, but in particular House Resolution 355, which condemns in the strongest terms the murderous terrorist attacks in Manchester, United Kingdom on Monday night. This serves as a sober reminder of our ongoing fight against terrorism at home and abroad and the global war on terrorism. This slaughter, a direct targeting of mass murder of children. It's been correctly identified by Prime Minister Theresa May that the murderers who have conducted this are cowards, correctly identified by President Donald Trump as losers. As the co-chairman of the EU and UK caucus, I am deeply saddened by these attacks. Thank you again, Chairman Royce. Thank you, Ranking Member Engel, for your support and expeditious consideration of the resolution. I would additionally like to ask my honorable co-chair of the EU caucus, Congressman Greg Meeks, to add me to this resolution as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
We go to Mr. Greg Meeks of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank you, Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, for us working together in a bipartisan manner on these resolutions, of which I support all of them. First, I want to, of course, H.R. Res. 355, which condemns the recent attacks in Manchester. I think this gives us an opportunity, again, to show a single voice from our committee, and that gives all members of the House to first voice condolences to the families and friends of those who were killed in these wicked bombings. And I pray that the Manchester community is able to remain strong and to continue its beautiful human display of kindness in the depths of such tragedy, as we saw and Prime Minister May talked about. Even with such bad circumstances, you see such good come from human beings as they work together. And I think that our voices reach, our hearts reach out to them, and the world needs to know that when we have these kinds of instances, we are one. And I think this resolution tends to give the message to let them know that we are with the people of Manchester and we are as one. I also want to just quickly give special recognition to and thank the sponsors for H.Res. 351, condemning the violence and the persecution in Chechnya. The persecution and suppression of human rights seems, unfortunately, not to be new in Chechnya, but the recent violence directed towards gay men at the hands of authorities is completely inhumane and a disturbing reality. Anyone who looks at the fiefdom of the warlord who seems to be running that area, Mr. Kaidarov, knows that whether you're a journalist or a politician, if you try to look into anything that he's doing, there's grave consequences. But when you look at these acts, I'm told, and I know from what I've gone up, that, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so when we see these things happening, our voices must be heard. And we cannot be silent and allow human beings to be treated in this way. And so I thank the sponsors of this legislation, this resolution, because I think our voices need to be heard and people know that we're not going to be tolerant of inhumane acts to human beings. And finally, let me also lend my voice to what we've all witnessed in horror when protesters in front of the Turkish ambassador's residence were forced to experience. Mr. Erdogan's posse outside didn't, seemed to have done the same thing previously, but for me, it still strikes at home. Because you see, I'm one that have been known at times when there's something that I feel is unjust, is not right, I go out and I protest in front of embassies. And so therefore, it's a way to speak and to have your, whether you agree or disagree, you're supposed to have the freedom, especially here in the United States. So it cannot go without my voice being heard, that those brutal beating of protesters who are just protesting and giving their voices, we must make sure that democracy and freedom of speech and being able to talk to, even if you disagree with the administrations or not, your voice needs to be heard. What took place was horrific, and we all need to speak out against that. So I hope that Turkey, who's a NATO ally, understands that we've got certain responsibilities as NATO allies to protect democracy and to move forward together in a democratic society, and that means all voices have the right to be heard. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Go to Ted Poe of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to speak on two of these bills, House Resolution 354 and 355. Turkey has been on a downward spiral under the aspiring dictator of Erdogan. Erdogan has spared no effort to undermine Turkey's democratic institutions, and he attacks civil liberties in Turkey. Now Erdogan thinks he can bring his crackdown on basic rights to the United States, to Washington, D.C., the seat of democracy in the world. Last week, when demonstrators peacefully protested outside the Turkish ambassador's home, they were attacked by Erdogan's bullies. His security beat and kicked and choked unarmed protesters. Video shows that Erdogan watched, and by watching, he gave a tacit approval to what was going on, because he did nothing except walk into the embassy. This kind of vicious behavior is unacceptable anywhere in the world, but especially here in America, in Washington, D.C. That's why I strongly support this resolution, which condemns this violence and calls on our government to raise the issue with Turkey. Freedom of expression is essential to the foundation of America, and it's clear that Erdogan does not honor this most basic right. But I am just incensed that he would bring his concept of no free speech to the United States. This attack by a foreign dictator on our constitutional basic right of speech is most disturbing. So while Erdogan continues his path of dictatorship in Turkey by violently quashing all opposition, this resolution sends, I hope, a message: we will have no foreign tyrant violating our sacred rights on American soil. Justice demands that something occur and that he be held accountable and Turkey be held accountable, because justice is what we do in this country. And regarding the murder of the innocents in Manchester, as those fans streamed out of a concert in Manchester, they were met with the worst kind of evil, ISIS. And we must call ISIS out for what they are. They are an evil group of people who murder children and anybody else. The terrorist lay in waiting, timing his bomb attack to inflict maximum damage as people were leaving the concert. We know that at least 22 innocent people were murdered, including children. The attack claimed by the ISIS killers is not the first to haunt Europe, and it's probably not going to be the last until ISIS is completely defeated. I strongly support this bill and offer my sincere condolences to the victims and to the families. And I want to acknowledge the brave efforts of the first responders who were quickly there to save many lives that dark night. Many people who will never know their identity, but they were there helping to rescue, because that's what first responders do wherever they are in the world. Islamic terrorist groups continue to threaten peace and security worldwide. Free nations need to understand and work together to defeat ISIS in a coordinated effort. Otherwise, ISIS will continue to pop up its ugly head and take advantage of peace and try to make a statement by killing folks that they don't agree with. So support both of these. I'm glad to be a co-sponsor of both of these. And I also want to make one other comment regarding what Congressman Meeks said about the protesters out in front of the Turkish embassy. I would encourage them to go back to the Turkish embassy and protest again. Do it again and keep protesting and stay out there, because no foreign tyrant, as I said, has the right or the ability to drive them away. So for whatever it's worth, I would encourage them to go back. You might find Mr. Meeks out there with them, and myself as well. And
Would
I'll
the gentleman yield for a question?
I will.
If the protesters return to the Turkish embassy, as you have just suggested they do, in order to, number one, draw attention to this monstrous attack on American soil of Americans by these goons from Turkey, if they do that, will you go with me and join them for a few minutes?
Yes, let's go together, and we'll bring Congressman Meeks with us as well.
If the gentleman yield, I'll join you as well.
Maybe we should just recess over to the Turkish embassy. I'll yield back.
I
Mr.
think the
Chairman.
gentleman's time is expired. Mr. Espiat of New York.
Thank you, Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Ingalls. I commend you on this bipartisan work of this committee in moving these 5 very, very important bills forward. And I join my colleagues in standing with the people of Manchester. I mourn for the young lives that were taken too soon in Monday's terrorist attack. Make no mistake, this was an act of terror. It was stone cold and heartless. As a parent, I can't even imagine the heartbreak that these families are experiencing. I also stand with the LGBT community in Chechnya, and Chechnya's LGBT cleansing must stop. This campaign is a crime against humanity, and the atrocities being committed against the LGBT Chechens must stop. The U.S. government can and should do much more, and I'm proud to sit on this committee that's willing to go on the record in publicly condemning the violence and the persecution in Chechnya. President Putin and the Kremlin need to investigate, prosecute, and protect the LGBT Chechens. I hope that this is a wake-up call for President Trump to defend and acknowledge LGBT lives across the world. And lastly, I'm proud to support the Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2017, which makes a permanent the Obama administration's policy to seek greater involvement for women in conflict prevention, resolution, and recovery efforts. Women here and around the world are the spine and a critical part of the peace-building efforts. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. Paul Cook of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I start, I want to know if Mr. Rohrbacher is going to be soliciting contributions for bail money for himself and the rest of the members that will be joining him outside the Turkish embassy. But anyway, I'm honored to join Representative Meeks in sponsoring H Resolution 355, condemning the terrorist action in Manchester, but saddened that it is necessary. Just as one horrifying terrorist attack in the United Kingdom left the headlines, we are once again reminded of the constant threat we face. For the second time in 2 months, the British people find themselves in mourning for the victims of a terrorist attack. Our thoughts and prayers are with the victims of the Manchester attack and with all of our friends in the United Kingdom. Just last month, I led a congressional delegation to the United Kingdom. Our visit came on the heels of a horrendous terrorist attack in London on March 22nd. We laid wreaths on Westminster Bridge and inside Westminster Hall to honor the victims of that attack. It was an honor for us to participate in that event, which highlighted the unbreakable bond we share with the British people. While that solemn occasion left us with heavy hearts, it also left us with an even stronger sense of resolve. The British and the American peoples are no strangers to outside enemies wishing to destroy our way of life. We have stood side by side to triumph in these fights before and have become stronger partners for the fights to come. During our discussions with officials in London, it was clear that all of us shared a fierce determination to prevent the next attack. Despite our successes and the many plots we have stopped, our failure rate remains much too high. It has been said many times, but it is worth repeating. We have to be right every time. The terrorists only have to be right once. Although the threat of terrorism is not new, it is rapidly changing. The terrorists are simplifying their methods, making it harder on us to prevent these low-tech attacks. Terrorist groups have adjusted their strategies for recruitment and found new ways to capture the minds of disillusioned youth and inspire attacks around the world. We must never grow comfortable with the occurrence of these attacks or numb to the depravity of our enemy. As the Manchester attack shows, there is no target too innocent or sacred, not even a crowd of children. I'm honored to co-sponsor this important resolution, and I'm proud to reinforce our shared commitment to confronting the threat of terrorism. Once again, I want to thank Representative Meeks for drafting this resolution and to thank this committee for its swift passage. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Brad Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, Chairman Royce. I want to thank the Chairman and the Ranking Member for holding this markup today. I appreciate the timely consideration of these bipartisan pieces of legislation that address some of the most pressing security issues and threats to human rights facing the world today. I join with my colleagues in offering my sincerest condolences to the victims of the horrific terrorist attack in Manchester on Monday evening, many of them children, and condolences to their families. I condemn this senseless violence targeting innocent civilians in the strongest possible terms and affirm the special relationship between American and British people. I fully support HRES 355 and the commitment of the United States to combating terrorism that threatens our democratic values. I would like to also express my strong support for H.R. 2484 that calls for women to be actively included and engaged in conflict resolution processes and encourages the State Department and USAID to increase women's participation in peacekeeping operations. Women and girls face a disproportionate share of violence and economic hardship as a result of armed conflict, including horrendous crimes of sexual violence. A conflict resolution process that does not include women will not adequately address these concerns. When women are included, as the resolution states, negotiations are more likely to succeed and result in durable peace agreements. The bill also highlights the critical role of our State Department and USAID diplomats and development professionals in resolving conflicts throughout the world through non-military means. Implementing this legislation will require that Congress ensure a robust budget for diplomacy and development, which is critical to a successful U.S. foreign policy. I am proud to be a co-sponsor of HRES 354 condemning the vicious attacks against peaceful protesters by Turkish President Erdogan's security detail, calling for the prosecution of those responsible and urging the administration to take appropriate diplomatic steps to ensure that Turkish officials are held accountable. President Erdogan, through a constitutional referendum last month, has consolidated extraordinary power in the executive branch. Under his administration, press freedoms have been restricted, opposition party leaders jailed, and ethnic minority groups threatened. The United States must be candid and consistent in our support of democratic values and respect for human rights for the sake of Turkey's future, as well as for the long-term interests in the region of the United States and our allies. Furthermore, it is never acceptable for guests of our government to violate our sacred right to freedom of speech on our own soil. Earlier this week, I joined with my colleague, Congressman Charlie Dent, in sending a letter to Secretary Tillerson condemning the thuggish attacks, which occurred under the watchful eye of President Erdogan himself. This attack was a direct offense against all Americans and the rights, values, and freedoms that underlie the very foundation of our democracy. These brutal attacks that led to the hospitalization of peaceful protesters are tantamount to an assault on the core pillars of our republic. This is not the first, but the third case of members of the Turkish president's security detail acting violently on U.S. territory. It must be the last. I'm also proud to be a co-sponsor of H.Res. 351, condemning the persecution and ghastly violence and torture against LGBTQ Chechnyans. I am horrified and extremely concerned by the recent news that Chechnya has been illegally arresting men suspected of being gay and forcing them into secret prisons. As many as 100 men are currently held in these barbaric prisons, and at least 3 have died in detention, not for any crimes they have committed, but simply for who they are and who they love. President Putin bears the responsibility for ending this persecution of LGBTQ people. He has long turned a blind eye to human rights abuses from the leader of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov. These atrocities cannot go unanswered. And indeed, this resolution represents a bipartisan call for the Trump administration to speak out against these crimes, demand the release of those illegally detained, and help those who are fleeing the violence, and pressure Russia to uphold respect for human rights and hold accountable those responsible for these abuses. I would like to thank the committee again for considering these important and relevant bills, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Ann Wagner of Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to express my support for all of the bills being considered here this morning. I'd first like to express my heartfelt condolences to the innocent victims, children, and families of the Manchester tragedy. There is no coherence at all to such injustice, no words for such despicable hatred. And as a mother who on many occasions took her young children to a concert, a festival, a gathering, to specifically target our innocent youth is barbaric and frankly unthinkable. My heart aches for the loss of these families, and I thank my colleagues for this resolution. And I, too, want to join the chorus of others who stand with the LGBT community in Chechnya. The brutality and the prejudice is, again, unthinkable, and I'm glad that this committee is standing together as a whole. I especially want to speak this morning about the Women, Peace, and Security Act of 2017. As a proud mother of an active-duty United States Army captain, I am very invested in good solutions to conflict situations around the world. It is hard for me to imagine why anyone thinks it's a good idea to negotiate anything, let alone peace, without women at the table. Mothers and women worldwide should be primary participants in the peace negotiations that so deeply impact them and their families. We know that peace processes that include women have a 35% better chance of lasting at least 15 years. That translates not only into dollars saved, but lives saved. I thank my colleagues for this important legislation. Mr. Chairman, I would also like to comment on House Resolution 354, condemning the violence against peaceful protesters outside the Turkish ambassador's residence on May 16th. Speaking on behalf of the many constituents in my district, Missouri's 2nd Congressional District, who have ties to Turkey, I was appalled to see such a violation of basic constitutional rights on American soil. I urge the Turkish government to respect freedom of expression, speech, and assembly for all people in Turkey, and especially here in the United States of America. Anything less is intolerable, and I would be proud to join my colleagues in protest again in front of the Turkish embassy. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Mr. Ted Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to co-sponsor the resolution condemning the violence and persecution of the LGBT community in Chechnya and the Manchester resolution, and I'm supportive of all the resolutions. But I wanted just to take a moment to talk about what happened in Manchester and the resolution that we're about to pass. Our condolences go out to the families of all who lost loved ones and of all the injured. And at this time of year, like so many of us, I've been reflecting a lot on young people. I was on stage a couple nights ago as 500 students, my son included, received his high school diploma. And it's impossible at a beautiful event like that, something that's happening in cities and towns all across America, to think about the horrific and vile and cowardly action like that committed by this terrorist in Manchester. There is an opportunity at moments like this to express condolences and to let the citizens of Manchester and the citizens of England understand how resolutely we stand with them and how nations throughout the world stand to fight this evil scourge of terrorism. There is also an opportunity, though, to think about, and particularly as we've seen the photos come out over the past couple of days of the victims, to think about these young people whose lives were extinguished, and to think about all of the young people who are not much older than all those students getting their high school diplomas this month and next month, who are on the front lines fighting back to keep us safe, who are on the ground as first responders, rushing when there is an attack, who do so much to keep us safe and to help make us the country that we are in leading this battle. This, Mr. Chairman, as you know, is a sometimes divisive place. It's true for this committee, it's true for the Congress as a whole. But when 22 lives are taken by terrorists and dozens more are injured, and so many of them are children, are kids, there is an opportunity to pause for just a second, and to pause as we're getting ready to head home, to realize that in the midst of all of these very difficult, sometimes nasty battles that we're engaged in, that ultimately we're able to engage in these battles because of what we share. And it is a commitment to freedom and democracy, the same kind of commitment and openness that our allies share, the same kind of openness that made people feel comfortable to drop their kids off at a concert in Manchester. And it is that same commitment and defending that freedom that we are speaking out in support of when we pass this resolution. We have just a moment like this to be grateful that we can come together, to remember how important it is, and to let that guide us as we go about the rest of our work. We'll never bring back the lives of those kids who perished in Manchester, but we absolutely can help to honor their memory and the memory of all those whose lives are taken by terrorists in fighting back to preserve our freedoms, to defend our freedoms, and to defeat this terrible scourge of terrorism. I yield back.
We thank you for your eloquent, heartfelt remarks, Mr. Deutsch. We now go to Steve Shabbat of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my colleagues on both sides of the aisle have, I think, so well and so thoroughly articulated the reasons why each of these resolutions are so important and ought to be supported, that I'll be very brief in my comments. I would urge my colleagues to support them all. And just commenting again on Manchester, which happened so recently, you know, the first thing that struck me was, you know, what kind of sick mind could have prevented or could have done such a horrible thing, you know, to assemble a bomb made of, nuts and bolts and nails, and then to detonate that bomb among children. What kind of sick mind would do such a thing? And it's the same kind of sick mind that drove a stolen truck through a crowd in Nice, France, that blew up U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, that blew up trains in Madrid, Spain, that murdered innocent people at a nightclub here in the United States in Orlando, that slaughtered unarmed U.S. military personnel at Fort Hood, that killed and maimed innocents at the Boston Marathon, that butchered people at an office party in San Bernardino, and yes, that brought down those buildings, and that struck the Pentagon not too far from here on September 11th, 2001. And it's radical, jihadist, terrorists that we and other nations around the world have been dealing with for a long time, and unfortunately will probably have to deal with far into the future. And we and the other nations around the world need to be very serious about this. It has to be fought, yes, within Saudi Arabia. That's where most of those folks that hit us on September 11th were from. And that's why I think President Trump's trip recently was so important, to get those Sunni nations on our side. And when I say our side, I mean the side of freedom-loving people all over the world, and that's the vast majority of the people on this globe, including Muslims and non-Muslims. They're overall very peaceful people who just want to raise their children and be able to take them to a concert and not wonder if they're actually going to come home, or if they're going to come home disfigured or blinded or with their eardrums burst. It's just horrific stuff that the civilized world is dealing with right now. So I hope that the President made some progress in that trip recently, because we have to have those folks in particular on our side, because they're within their midst. They're here too. They're in England, they're all over Europe and all over the world. So it's a battle that the world better get serious about, because if there's not, there's going to be a lot more victims. And I yield back.
Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, for putting together an excellent package of legislation for us to consider, and that appears to have the wide support of everyone on the committee. I look forward to marking up the bill on Iran, which I know that we're still working on and improving. As to the individual pieces of legislation, if Putin is going to claim sovereignty over Chechnya, he must take responsibility for what goes on there. And this savage and gruesome attack on the LGBTQ community there is simply outrageous. If we're able to get one of the survivors from Chechnya here, I think that should be the occasion of a hearing, either of our committee or of the relevant subcommittee.
I think you're absolutely right, Mr. Sherman.
The second bill deals with this terrible incidents at the Turkish ambassador's residence. I look forward to joining with the gentleman from California and apparently most of the committee in demonstrating in front of that residence that we will not be cowed, and that free speech and the right to assemble continues to exist in the United States, even if it doesn't exist in Turkey. But we should go beyond this and say that unless the perpetrators are extradited with a waiver of their immunity here to the United States, that we should by statute prohibit Erdogan ever bringing a security detail back to the United States. They should not be given visas. All of us depend upon American security for our security, and if the President of Turkey wants to return here, he should also rely on the host government, just as our ambassador relies on the host government in Turkey every day. it would simply be outrageous for us to grant visas to the same security force that has assaulted Americans, fled the jurisdiction, hid behind diplomatic immunity, and trampled on American freedoms. As to the resolution condemning the terrorist attack in Manchester, I join with the comments made earlier by so many of our colleagues, including the gentleman from Florida and the gentleman from Ohio, and agree that we need to be talking to our friends in Saudi Arabia about what version of Islam they are supporting around the world. Women are critical for peace and security, and I think the gentlelady from Missouri expressed that well, as did others. And finally, as to State Department reauthorization, the State Department Authorities Bill, any reorganization plan needs to be submitted for review to this committee. But it would be good if we could prevail upon the Secretary of State to actually appoint people to serve in the various posts of the State Department. If he wants to put together a reorganization plan later, that's fine. But it's hard to have diplomacy with so very few of the appointed spots filled. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this pack of bills that put us on record on some areas that we definitely should be on record as Americans and as members of the United States Congress. First, about the Turkish Prime Minister or President who came here and allowed his, not only allowed, but watched as his security detail brutally beat American citizens, bloodied these people who have every right to be there protesting as U.S. citizens, and President Erdogan sat and watched that. This, I hope he gets the message through this legislation. He is not welcome in the United States if he is going to think that he can attack Americans for expressing their opinion and their opposition to his policies. Let us note that he is turning Turkey into what was an acceptable level of democracy into a country that is being turned over to the worst type of Islamic terrorist dictatorship that exists in the world. And he has arrested tens of thousands of people. This is not the kind of person that we should be kissing up to. And he made the situation even worse when he called the American ambassador in a few days ago, and in an arrogant insult to the American people, suggested that we should in some way apologize for the brutal attack on American citizens by his own bodyguards. No, Erdogan, if he thinks this way, he's not welcome in our country. Number two, about Manchester, let us just note, this emphasizes again that we are at war, and our primary enemy in this war are radical Islamic terrorists who murder innocent people. They're not at war with our military. They're not at war with the establishment. They are attacking and targeting helpless Americans and helpless other people throughout the world. It reminds me, when we talk about innocent people being killed over in Manchester, reminds me that, of course, Great Britain went through another period of bombing. In World War II, the Nazis brutally bombed civilian targets in Britain. Well, Britain and the United States and Britain and the rest of the world stood together against this evil, and we need to stand together against this evil. Again, let no one doubt that America will stand with them in this effort to defeat the current evil that threatens Western civilization. Let us note also, and I'm going to put this in passing, that during the Second World War, the primary evil was the Nazis and the Japanese militarists. During that time, Yes, we worked with Joseph Stalin in Russia. We should be working with Russia to defeat the radical Islamic terrorists that threaten Western civilization. But let us note that I support your a bill today which would draw attention to the suppression of the LGBT community in Chechnya. The fact is, when Russia does something wrong, we should condemn it. We should make sure that is a policy, and this type of again, repression by an ally in our fight against radical Islam, it behooves us to be on record against that policy in Russia and let the people of the world know that we stand for freedom in the United States of America and also don't put up with this type of bloody repression. So with that said, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've provided great leadership for this committee on these moral issues.
Thank you. Any other members seeking recognition? If not, hearing no further requests, the question occurs on the items considered en bloc. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the measures are considered en bloc and are agreed to. And without objection, the measures considered en bloc are ordered favorably reported as amended. Staff is directed to make any technical and conforming changes, and the chair is authorized to seek House consideration under suspension of the rules. And that concludes our business for today. Again, I would like to thank not just Ranking Member Engel, but all of our committee members for their contributions, for their assistance in today's markup. The committee stands adjourned.